Katie has been an incredible resource to the Commonwealth for the past 20 years as state public health veterinarian and state epidemiologist, and has been a leader nationally as well, just finishing her presidency of the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists, and a major thought leader as well in the public health community. Tonight, she's going to talk about the interface of humans and animals in the One Health context, and a very important topic. And I can imagine no one being more capable of presenting that with a clarity and depth of knowledge. Thank you, Katie, for joining us, and turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Al. I am delighted to be here. I see several names of folks that I actually know. So hi, good to see you. Hi, Lewis. Hi, Mary. As Al mentioned tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about One Health. And if you are not familiar with that topic, you will get an introduction tonight. And I really want to focus on sort of how humans or the types of relationships that humans and other animals have with each other, and how that actually plays into some of the One Health issues that we're gonna talk about. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. And Al, just give me a thumbs up that you're seeing the screen. Awesome. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, we're gonna go ahead. I'll give you a quick introduction to One Health. We'll move into talking about some of the animal and human interactions. Then we'll talk about really what is my favorite topic ever, which is zoonotic disease. So infectious diseases transmissible between animals and humans. We'll talk about reverse zoonoses, and then we're going to end with what do we do with this information? How can we use it to help us? So if you Google One Health, you can actually find a bunch of different definitions. And I think this is actually one of the problems that I have with this term, right? Is that it means something slightly different to different people. The definition that we're going to work with tonight, the one that I'm showing here on the screen right now, is my favorite definition, and it's really sort of the way I think about One Health. So, fundamentally, One Health is sort of an acknowledgement and an understanding that the health of people is linked to the health of animals, is linked to the health of the environment, is linked back to the health of people, right? We all live in the same environments together, and the health of all three of these parts of the world that we live in are interconnected. I really believe that true One Health, really the kind of in its purest sense, requires not just that understanding, but the collaborative efforts of all of the disciplines that work in those different areas, and that what we are striving for as we work together is optimal health, not just for the human component of the environment of this world that we live in, but optimal health for people, animals, and our environment. And that really is what it takes to practice One Health, is all of the disciplines working together with the same shared goal of improving the health of each of these components. So I hope that makes sense. And that really is kind of where I'm coming from when I talk about everything we're going to talk about here. So, to be fair, One Health is this really monstrous topic. It's really huge, and and we could like talk about it for the next 3 days, which we are not going to do. And so, what I wanted to do was settle in on sort of one piece of it. And what I want to really think about is the ways that humans and other animals interact together, because it's those interactions that can really impact the ways diseases spread between different species of animals, including humans. I don't want you to think that I'm forgetting the environmental component of this, because I'm not. I'm not, however, going to talk about sort of the whole environment. We're not going to talk about climate change here. Happy to come back another time and talk about that. But what I do want to talk about is these interactions between animals and humans, and the environments, the smaller environments that those interactions happen in. So it's still looking at these three different components. It's just kind of a smaller cut of the environment. All right, so we're going to think about these interactions between humans and animals using pictures, because it's more fun that way, right? Um, and we're not going to think about everything, but I want to cover a few examples. And so this is different varieties of how we interact with poultry, right? So the picture on the left is really thinking more about kind of poultry in terms of food production, either for eggs or for meat. And we do this in a fairly, intensive way in the United States. But also, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but also backyard poultry, right? This like keeping a kind of a handful of birds in our backyards for primarily for eggs, but also, because they're cute, right? And people like to interact with them. Um, we also do that, and that's another way that we interact with these birds. Now, if you looked across the world, across the globe, you can see that there are other ways that other cultures may interact with these same types of animals, right? So on the left, this is actually an old photo from, I believe, a National Geographic story about avian influenza, um, demonstrating that in some cultures, the people who work with poultry, raising them for food, often have to share the same environment with those poultry. So very, very close connections and interactions. And then you can see also in another photo, also from avian influenza in the past, sort of bringing birds to market in a way that you would probably not see in the US. But in the US, we certainly have done things like dye little chicks different colors for Easter, something which I think has mostly stopped happening, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, which is good that it doesn't happen. But we also have these amazing opportunities, I think are amazing opportunities for children, right, to observe hatching and growing chicks, right? It's a kind of a grade school or even sometimes kindergarten project that helps children understand about the world around them and about animals. Every year, many of our states have agricultural fairs, and they invite people in to have some direct interaction with different kinds of animals. And one of the reasons to do this is that in the US in general, we have become so separated from how our food gets made that this is an opportunity for folks from maybe urban and suburban areas to really have an opportunity to connect with some of these animal species that they would really never see otherwise. Um, I I showed this picture, which is an actual example of an agricultural fair. I showed this one because I can't help but think about how stressed those animals must be, kind of in the middle of this crowd of humans that, in a way that they're not used to living in. And for those of you who are medically trained on this call, you will know that stressed animals often produce more pathogens, more germs than non-stressed animals. We certainly use animals in laboratory settings for all kinds of different research. I think the way that we use them in research has been changing over certain years, over recent years, but it is certainly something that happens and that is really important as we're thinking about development of drugs and medical devices in particular. Something that is that happens in Massachusetts and not everywhere in the world. So this is actually harvesting horseshoe crab blood, because the blood is useful for detecting bacterial contamination in different medical products. And it's fun to see. You may not know a lot about horseshoe crabs, but they're unique in that their blood is actually blue because it's copper based instead of iron based. And then here's another way that we interact with non-domestic animals. So these are multiple pictures of strandings, right? So these are all animals that normally live in water, in the ocean specifically here, and yet under certain circumstances, they may end up on the beach because they're sick, because the water gets too cold and they can't move anymore, and for all kinds of other reasons that we really don't understand. And as a species, humans are really reluctant to just stand by and sort of let this happen and not try to step in and help. And so there are whole networks around the world called stranding networks. And these are volunteers as well as often trained government officials who respond to these strandings to try to help return as many animals as possible back into their ocean habitat. So other opportunities for direct contact and interactions with these animals. This is one of my favorite examples. So camels in the kingdom uh, in Saudi Arabia are like dairy cows, beef cows, racehorses, pulling horses, so workhorses, beloved Labradors, and living daily reminders of Holy Scripture all in one. And that phrase, that statement really sort of demonstrates exactly how important camels are to their culture and lifestyle. They really do almost everything in Saudi Arabia. And so I think there's a bunch of pictures here that kind of outline that exactly how closely they end up living with their camels in many aspects. And then I couldn't forget ecotourism, which is growing every year. Took a break during the pandemic, but other than that, it is really growing everywhere every year. And this is where people from different countries go out to observe nature and wildlife in countries that they are not familiar with. And this ecotourism generates lots of money for the countries that get traveled to. It's a very important source of income for them, but it is also, again, an opportunity for interaction between animals and people. So I think I covered most of these, right? This is sort of the uh, written list of all of the pictures that we just showed. I think a couple of things that I didn't mention are that pit viper venom is actually used to produce a medication to help prevent blood clots. I didn't talk a lot about the fact that many of us have pets that we share our homes with. There's animal therapy, also something I didn't specifically mention. And then, of course, because of all the interactions, the type of interactions we have, there's veterinary medicine as well, right? So doctors to care for care for those animals that we spend so much time with. All right. So that's kind of the setting. Again, like you could probably imagine all kinds of other interactions that we have with animals, either you personally or people that you know. And so what I'm going to ask you is, all right, so what could go wrong? And we're going to talk just a little bit about the things that can go wrong. Um, and of course, because I'm trained in infectious disease, I will always love infectious disease the most. I can't help it. It's just what I love. So what we're going to do is talk about zoonotic diseases. So these are diseases that are transmissible from animals to people. And they are very common both in the US and around the world. And this statistic, I mean, you can just find this almost everywhere. So scientists estimate that about 60% of known infectious diseases in people can be spread from animals. And I just want to be very clear, this is globally, right? This is not talking about the US specifically. This is globally. Um, and I also want to point out, it says can be spread from animals because there are certainly diseases that can be zoonotic that we as humans can get from animals, but that we could also get from other people. And then 75% of new or emerging infectious diseases in people come from animals. And of course, we could probably talk about COVID as sort of one of the most recent examples of that, a virus that probably came originally from a non-human animal and then caused a global pandemic. Um, I, yeah. Anyway, these statistics are quoted ad nauseum, right? You can't, if you're talking about zoonotic disease, if you Google zoonotic disease, this is one of the most common things that comes up. And so here's the way we're going to now kind of talk about zoonotic disease. And I hope that these graphs actually remind you a little bit of that One Health triad that I showed you at the beginning, right? The humans, animals, and environment sort of all together. In order for an infectious disease to spread, you need a couple of things all together in the same place within the same environment, right? You need a species, an animal that has the germ, the pathogen in it normally. Okay, so that's the reservoir host. For a vector-borne disease, one that's spread by ticks or mosquitoes or lice or something else, you need that vector present. You also need the pathogen present, right? If you have the species and the vector, but none of them are carrying that pathogen, that germ, then, who cares? And you need a susceptible human population. And it's only where all four of those things intersect in the same environment that you actually get disease transmission. On the right-hand side, I actually collapsed the reservoir and the competent vector into one circle. And that's because not all diseases are vector-borne, right? You don't always need a tick or a mosquito or a louse to spread disease. And so if the vector species is the same as the reservoir, then you only need these three things in the same place in the environment to result in disease transmission. Now, if we think globally, right, so across the world, some of the factors that have been shown to be major causes of the emergence or reemergence of some of these zoonotic diseases are, as the human population expands, there's increasing demand for animal protein, right? Animal protein it has a lot of calories. It's good for people, essentially, particularly when they are not living in a place like the United States that has, 1,000 different cookie brands available. The sort of intensification of agriculture that's happened across the world in order to produce more food for the population is another major cause of zoonotic disease. Sort of the increased use and exploitation of wildlife, another cause. And I'm just going to say that the intensification of agriculture, so taking up land to grow more crops and then using wildlife for whatever purpose you're using for, both of those actually change human animal interactions as well and increases human animal interactions. And so in and of themselves, they may not be enough to drive zoonotic disease emergence, but if you think about them as increasing interactions between humans and animals, you can draw an easy connection with how they might impact disease transmission. And the same is true for land use changes, right? So as we take more and more land for human development, we are putting people and animals into competition with each other for the same spaces. When we go out and try to extract natural resources from the ground, from the earth, we are also going into competition with animals for the same land. And those are things that again change and increase human animal interactions. Habitat restoration is something that happens kind of a lot here in the US in a more developed nation, where we're aware of the fact that we're doing some of these other things and taking land and using it for our own purposes. And so there have been specific attempts to actually give back, right, and to restore some of the previous habitat, which can create its own set of problems and spread zoonotic disease. Travel and transportation, also drivers of zoonotic emergence, changes in the chains of food supply, how much we move food around in order to meet the demand of all the different populations, and climate change, of course. And many of these things are also changing human and animal interactions. All right, so we're going to go through a few examples. That was the how could things go wrong? And now I'm going to give you the examples of how of when it did go wrong. So this is one of those agricultural fairs that I mentioned before. And this was a bunch of E. coli infections, so a bacteria that can be carried asymptomatically in multiple species of animals. But when it gets into humans, can cause very severe illness and, in fact, even death sometimes. And there were it was about 1,300 grade school children who were brought in to learn about how milk gets produced. And out of those attendees, they ended up with 60 cases of these E. coli infections with 11 hospitalizations. They were fortunate that nobody died. And they eventually found that the E. coli bacteria that was found in people had also been found on bleachers that were stored inside the dairy barns. So they had all these opportunities to get contaminated from the cows. And I will just note that people who reported hand washing were less likely to get sick. And it's why hand washing is my #1 piece of advice to everybody to help stay healthy. So backyard chickens, let's talk about them a little bit. So the number of households with backyard chickens in the US has increased 28% in 2 years. 28%. And that's great, right? There are lots of good things about doing this. And remember, I'm a veterinarian, so I actually think animals and humans interacting is generally a good thing as long as you do it carefully. And while I think the expression on this little boy's face who's holding this chick is delightful and beyond adorable, it does make me cringe, because unless his parent is right there to show him how to wash his hands as soon as he puts the chick down, he's really putting himself at risk here. And in fact, backyard poultry is really, as it's grown as a hobby, we're starting to see more and more outbreaks related to that. So the graph on the left is from 1990 to 2012. And I'll just say the black line is the number of outbreaks that were recorded each year. And the number of outbreaks is, smaller. It's under 10. That's the axis on the left. But the number of cases you can see increased over time. And in fact, by 2012, the last year of this study, they had over 500 cases reported of this is of salmonella, again, a bacteria that lives in the GI tract of animals that frequently does not cause symptoms in them, but can cause severe disease in people. What I will tell you is that for every diagnosed case of salmonella, there are probably at least, 40 or so undiagnosed cases. And so 500 cases, multiply that by 40, and you're starting to get into the neighborhood of the total number of cases. And then the graph on the right is from a later publication, and it shows similar data from 2015 to 2022. And what I really want to flag is the number of cases on the axis on the right has changed tremendously. So while 2012 had, a little over 500 cases, in 2020, the pandemic year when everybody started buying backyard poultry, 1,700 cases, okay? So this is definitely something that we are seeing an increase in salmonella related to owning backyard poultry. You can see this happened across the country. The darker the state, the more cases, but really it's happened everywhere. And one of the comments in the paper is that historically these outbreaks really only occurred in young children. They only happened around Easter, and it was because they were dyeing those chicks those bright colors, right? And the first large outbreak that involved many states across the US where backyard flocks were recognized as the cause was in 2007. At this point, there are 20 different companies across the country that you can call and order chicks from, hatching chicks, right? And so these 20 facilities generate $50 to $70 million in sales every year. You can just call and say, I want you to send me 100 chicks. Each chick will cost less than $5, and they get shipped through the US Postal Service. I'm just going to say they stick all the little just hatched chicks into cardboard boxes and then mail them to you. So they're easy to get, which is one of the reasons that, and relatively cheap, which is one of the reasons that we have seen such an increase. And in fact, 2025 had the largest backyard poultry salmonella outbreak to date, 559 cases with 125 hospitalizations, 2 deaths. And remember, 559 cases, that's of the people who were diagnosed and reported. And we would multiply that by at least 40 to get the real number of cases. All right, this is my favorite example. This little guy is an African giant pouched rat. Can't tell from the picture, but he's actually about 3 feet long from nose to tip of tail. And I can imagine some of you cringing. That's fine. They're super cute. They're also super intelligent. And these animals have been trained in their native Africa. They have been trained to detect landmines, right? Because they're so light that they won't set off the landmine, and they can smell it. They don't have very good sight, but they have excellent smell. So they detect the landmines so that they can be safely diffused. And then on the left, you can see this is actually a rat named Carolina, who was used to help identify people infected with tuberculosis. Again, something that she was trained to smell so that she could identify people who needed to be, receive medical testing and treatment, so that then, and also those people could be, removed from the public for a short period of time so that they weren't spreading the disease. Really smart animals, even if you're not a big fan of rats. which is all fine, except that there are people in the U.S. who like rats and wanted to import them, or people were importing them so that they could be sold in pet stores. Okay, but that meant taking these rats out of their natural environment and in the distributors, so the companies that purchased these rats and imported them then put them appropriately into a quarantine facility, right? Because they should be kept isolated for a while to, to make sure they don't have a disease before you sell them as pets. The problem is it wasn't really that great a quarantine situation because they were very close to other species of animals, including this little prairie dog here, another animal species that people like to adopt. And so what happened is the African giant pouched rats were carrying monkeypox. Back when we still called it monkeypox, right? We call it mpox now. But at the time in 2003, when this outbreak occurred, it was still monkeypox. And the giant pouched rats showed no symptoms, but they were carrying the virus. When they were placed near to the prairie dogs, there was apparently enough kind of respiratory transmission that they were able to spread the virus. And then when people adopted the prairie dogs and took them home, they ended up with monkeypox infection, like you can see on the hand on this in this photo. I mean, luckily it stayed a relatively small outbreak and nobody, nobody got seriously ill or died. But, who would have thought that all of those sort of little steps would have led to, you know, uh, humans in the United States getting infected with a virus that only naturally occurs in Africa. And because there are so many of these little pocket pet type species, they ended up testing other animals to see, who else had gotten exposed and infected. And you can see the list on the right of animals that tested positive. And just so you know, the top one is an African dormouse, super cute. You can see why people might want to have one as a pet. The middle picture is a jerboa, also super cute. And then the one on the bottom is a South American coati. But all of these were animals that were shown to have been exposed to the virus that causes monkeypox. And just to put kind of a weird end to this story, apparently some breeder had imported these giant pouched rats and then ended up releasing some into the Florida Keys. And there is now a free range population there that is actually fairly destructive. And there's a fair amount of time and energy spent into trying to prevent them from making it to the Florida mainland. All kinds of reasons that you should be careful about importing animals from other countries. Another kind of what went wrong story. So this is a Western dwarf clawed frog, also from Africa. They tend to live in shallow, warm, slow-moving streams, but they're commonly bred for the pet trade. And there was a 3-year outbreak related to this in people. Again, salmonella, because reptiles and amphibians are known to be to carry salmonella. You can see that most of the cases were in people who were less than 10 years of age. That's the green color in those bars. And you can see that it happened almost everywhere across the country. So turns out that, these are a popular pet. I don't know, they had their moment back in the mid 2010s. And in fact, some companies were selling these things called frogosphere kits. And there's a picture of them here, right? So these frogs are like 2.5 inches long. And the frogosphere kit is 6 by 5 by 4 inches. So really not very large. And in fact, you really should have 1 to 2 gallons of water per frog in order for them to have sort of a healthy, happy environment. And this frogosphere was really only giving them 20 to 40% of the recommended amount of water volume that they should have. So what happens when you put a living thing in a very confined space, particularly if it's water, right? They're going to shed their normal bacteria from their skin into that water. They're going to shed bacteria from their gastrointestinal tract into that water. And then whatever food they're getting is also going to add bacteria to that water. And you're just going to end up with a soup. It's a bacterial soup is what it is, which is why we ended up with 3 years of outbreak related to these little frogs, mainly because they were being kept in conditions that were inappropriate for them. So in an environment that just was not meant for them. Uh, Briefly, we'll do marine mammals. So this is something that happens in Massachusetts. So Cape Cod, as you all are probably aware, is a little bit of a hook shape, right? And so it's not uncommon for animals, these marine mammals and turtles, to strand on sort of that north-facing side of Cape Cod. That tends to be where they strand because they get caught in the Cape Cod hook. Some of it is also because the amount of tide variability that we have there, the difference between low and high tides can be 9 to 12 feet. Sometimes in the winter, we have this rapid change in water temperature. It goes from warm to cold very abruptly, and the turtles can't handle that. And I say that, and yet also with the overall warming water temperatures, that is probably also contributing to illness in animals and therefore stranding. And one of the things that has caused stranded marine mammals over the years are influenza viruses. So this is a flu virus. It's closely related to the one that causes a lot of flu in people during the winter, but it's not exactly the same. And the largest known outbreak in marine mammals up until this last year was in harbor seals in New England in 1980. And a lot of these marine mammals ended up getting pneumonia secondary to influenza, just like people do, and then also getting a bacterial infection with mycoplasma. And these viruses were found in a bunch of different species, but harbor seals were the ones that stranded most frequently. And from the same time period, there was a publication in the New England Journal of Medicine demonstrating that the people who were responding to these stranded seals were getting infected with the same influenza virus that the seals had, and it was causing conjunctivitis in them, so redness of the eyes. The good news is that it was a self-limiting disease. Nobody got seriously ill from that. They were able um, to connect connect the exposure in the seals to this disease in humans. And we have actually seen this over and over now in other avian influenza outbreaks, but it's kind of cool to see one of the first recognitions of this happening. And then my last example of things going wrong is one that if you're a pet owner, you may be able to understand, but there is this a developed specialty in veterinary medicine, which is palliative care, right? Essentially hospice for animals. It's called hospice. Um, and people take advantage of this, right? They want to give their animals the same type of end of life experience that we might give some of our human family members. But it can occasionally end up resulting in transmission, spread of disease from those animals. These are 3 human cases of infection with a bacteria called Pasteurella multocida, which normally is you can get an infection if a cat or a dog bites you. You can get a Pasteurella infection, but none of this was related to bites. This was simply due to the very intense close contact that these people were having over, multiple days with their dying animal. Probably, I'm just going to guess, a lot of face-to-face, nose-to-nose kissing that likely resulted in this transmission. Fortunately, all of these individuals recovered. So we often think about zoonotic disease, right? How the diseases that animals have get to us, and that's kind of a primary focus of public health. But for the purposes of One Health, we're also going to demonstrate that it goes the other way too. We share our diseases with animals. And just a couple of examples. So Western lowland gorillas are one of the most critically endangered animals in the world. Because of poaching and disease, the gorillas numbers declined more than 60% over the last 20 to 25 years. Although the good news is we're starting to make progress in the other direction again now, which is great. So this is actually from a couple of years ago, but at the time, scientists calculated that the population would take 75 years to recover if we could protect them entirely. Anyway, critically endangered, right? But because they're critically endangered and because humans have such an affinity for so many different species of animals, there are different groups that actually work with these gorillas to try to protect them. They provide a lot of veterinary care. There's a whole lot of behavioral research that happens as well. And this is one of the groups that is most heavily involved in doing some of this disease monitoring and interventions. But they were able to learn kind of by watching this that they could find human metapneumovirus, which is a virus that causes upper respiratory infection in people, as well as respiratory syncytial virus, RSV, in these groups. And it was very clear that it was introduced from humans. So in fact, these humans that were going there to try to help protect these populations were also bringing some of these harms with them. And it's not just gorillas, chimpanzees, also very closely related to humans. There's the evidence of Streptococcus pneumoniae, which is a bacteria that also causes pneumonia, respiratory infections, was spread to chimpanzees, and in fact, ended up killing 8 adults and 6 infant chimpanzees out of a group of 37. So that's 14 out of 37 deaths. That's a lot of mortality. And so, the question really becomes, how much are we helping and how much are we hurting? These groups have actually developed a lot of isolation and quarantine protocols for the humans that are coming in to help. And so they've been able to reduce the amount of disease, this reverse zoonosis that we see. So we've all learned from our mistakes and are able to now do more good than harm. But this is a publication actually from 2014, and you can see it based on a literature review, went through and found publications that demonstrated transmission of all of these different organisms. We've got viruses, bacteria, parasitic roundworms from gastrointestinal systems, other gastrointestinal parasites, and fungi, all being transmitted from humans to different groups of animals, companion animals, livestock, and wildlife. And so while we don't recognize, as humans, we don't recognize these reverse zoonoses as much as we recognize the times that we get diseases from animals, they are happening all the time. And in fact, the paper shows that the increasing frequency of identification of those It's hard to know. Some of that is going to be due to our changing environment and increasing interactions with humans, and some of it, or humans and animals, and some of it is also going to be due to we're looking for it more, and so we're going to find it more. Um, I ran across this, and so just sharing it with you all. Apparently, dogs can get mumps from people. It does not happen very often. It's very rare, um, but interesting, and actually not something they taught me in vet school. So thought I would share with all of you. And then because those examples I showed you were all a little bit older, I also just wanted to show you that these things are still happening, right? And so this is a paper um, with data from 2011 to 2018, and they're continuing to show influenza from people this time into marine mammals. So what do we do with all of this information that I've just told you? The kind of the traditional response is to either, ban the animals or kill the animals. That monkeypox story that I told you with the importation and giving the disease to prairie dogs who gave it to humans, right? The response was just to ban importation of these pouched rats, which I mean, okay, and certainly killing groups of animals to prevent disease transmission is something that continues to happen, and sometimes it's the right thing to happen. But I am going to say that those recommendations don't work as well as they used to because there's less and less sort of human appetite for them. There was a huge outbreak of foot and mouth disease in the United Kingdom in the early 2000s. So this is a disease of cattle, and people, families lost all of and all of the animals were destroyed. They were just all killed in an effort to eradicate the disease, and people and families lost their livelihoods. There were large numbers of suicides by farmers who had just lost everything. And so, sort of a recognition that that approach, while again, sometimes is necessary, it also has really bad impacts on the people. Hurricane Katrina, when we realized that people were not going to evacuate without their pets, right? That also was a signal to us. There was a large, kind of an outbreak of a particular virus in breeder mice that actually infected some of the people who worked in the breeding colonies, and the public health response was to say you have to kill all of your mice, and that also was very unacceptable to those people. It gave public health a really bad name, and it's taken a long time for us to try to recover from that. Avian influenza in backyard birds, right? Commercial poultry flocks get euthanized to help prevent the spread of the disease, but it's a commercial decision. It's really to save money. But in backyard flocks, right, these people love their birds. And so there has been sort of a move to develop a different approach. Don't just kill them, but like separate them out and test each animal until they become negative, and then the animals are allowed to live. And then I think there's also just these changing perceptions of animals. There have been changes in circus policies, the changes in shipping and holding of animals for slaughter. There's just a lot of different ways that we can see in our society that we are changing the way we sort of think about animals. And then there's this, right? People love their animals. Um, and they love them in many different ways and many different species of animals that you may or may not find personally attractive, but to somebody else, they are their companion, they are their friend. We have 94 million US households that own a pet. Um, I don't think this trend is changing very much over recent time, but we continue to see a large number, about 70% of households with pets. Um, mainly cats or dogs, although I wanted to point out where backyard chickens fall in this 2025 data. So 11 million households with backyard chickens, which is crazy. Um, and more than, freshwater fish, pocket pets, birds, reptiles, horses, or saltwater fish. But here's the problem. So the amount of knowledge that we have about human disease is actually really good, right? It's not complete, but it's very good. We know less about diseases that occur in domestic animals. We know less about zoonotic diseases that occur in domestic animals. We know less about diseases that occur in wildlife animals, less about zoonotic diseases that occur in those wildlife. And we know vanishingly little about zoonotic disease that occurs in marine life animals. And we know even less about about some of what happens in the environment. So we're at this information deficit, and yet hopefully I've convinced you that the more and more sort of interactions and the more and more variability of interactions that we have between humans and animals, sort of the greater their possibility and the opportunity for disease transmission. So one of the ways that I encourage people to think about this is to think about, in your world, right? What animals exist in your area? And think about domestic animals, exotic pets, wildlife, livestock, and think about how people are interacting with those animals. What potential pathogens do those animals carry that we're aware of, right? Understanding that there are gaps in our knowledge. And then also think about, how are we modifying our environment? How are we modifying the environment that the humans and animals interact in together? What are we changing? What are we making that's sort of abnormal in some way? And then what effect do those changes have on the animals or on us? Then we also have to think about what else is changing. Our climate is changing, and we're seeing new species coming into different areas, either purposeful release by, somebody who brings in an animal, or we're seeing, because of climate change, we are seeing different species move into new areas. And then we also have to think about the different ways that diseases can spread, right? Through respiratory, through fecal oral, so accidental ingestion, through vectors, ticks or mosquitoes, or through, the environment or something that an animal touched. We have to think about, how do we broaden diagnostic tools? So we're not just looking for the things we know, but how do we find out about the things that we don't know? And then I was actually trained by somebody who said to me that any disease could be zoonotic, and I'm going to add, or cause reverse zoonoses, given the right set of circumstances. And I actually think that's close to true. And again, because of the different ways that we're interacting with animals, I think that we are creating many, many different opportunities for disease transmission back and forth. And so here's how I'm circling back to One Health, right? I said at the beginning that what we needed were all of the disciplines together to think about how we optimize health in humans, in animals, and in the environment all at the same time. And so we need to think about, how do we pull veterinarians, physicians, other healthcare providers, people who work in laboratories, researchers, environmentalists, and even the public. How do we pull those groups together so that we are all at the table together to think about these different ways that we interact, what is changing, and how do we learn more about the different opportunities for disease transmission between these different groups? My one last thought, and this will be mainly for you to go off and think about on your own tonight, is these children which child is more at risk? Now, I gave you some scary statistics about zoonotic diseases and emerging diseases and things like that. But I am just also going to posit that when a disease has become adapted to humans and spreads between humans, like that's the most efficient way that disease spreads. And so I think we could make an argument either way, actually. You just have to be able to defend your position. So I will leave you to think about this, but maybe Dr. Lewis Faison wants to respond.
I really appreciate your presentation. I think many people do, and I'm glad it's recorded, Al DiMaria. Thank you for
Right,
recording it.
thanks to Paige.
Yes. So, but basically, humans are animals. So, and we're just a branch of the mammalian tree. And maybe could you go over a little bit more of just about how close we are, like our like the our organs, our genetics are so similar to animals. It's no wonder that we're just part of the whole animal kingdom. Could you go over some of the genetic factors of how close we are to other mammals?
Yeah, I mean, sort of not my real area of expertise, but I will say that one of the reasons that it's easiest to find examples of reverse zoonoses, right, transmission of human disease to chimpanzees and gorillas, is because of the very, very close genetic relationship that we have with those. I mean, what it's like 98%, right? Our genomes are identical. Which is, I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about. Now, if you want to talk about humans and horseshoe crabs, like I think it's a lot farther apart. But I will say that sort of as a broad generality, living things on our planet on Earth, I actually think have more in common than we do that are different, even if we're talking horseshoe crabs and humans, right?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for another wonderful presentation. And back on in April at Public Health Week, you talked about avian influenza, and I was wondering what your take is on the current H5N1 situation and where we're headed for in the next few months.
Oh, Al, that is a very good question. And I didn't bring avian influenza into this presentation much because I had talked about it for this audience recently. Um, this variant, this H5N1 subtype of avian influenza that we saw so much activity with last year, wild birds, domestic poultry, backyard poultry, and then the whole dairy cow thing, right? I think we're seeing evidence of it picking back up again, which is not surprising, right? This is a wild bird virus originally, and so it tends to spread during migration season, and we are sort of still in the middle of bird migration, and we're starting to see outbreaks again in commercial poultry flocks, who are the ones that are at greatest risk in other parts of the country. And I'm expecting, I'm not a betting person, but I think it would be reasonable to expect that we will see more activity again across the country. I am hoping that in Massachusetts, right, we had so much activity in wild birds last year. I'm actually hoping there's some level of immunity among our bird population, and maybe we won't see quite as significant outbreaks as we saw last year, but I can't promise that, right? I will just also say the influenza virus in birds, it behaves very much like influenza virus in humans. They're very closely related, and they do better in cold weather, right? And so it does tend to be kind of a winter phenomenon, not exclusively, but it tends to be. It's a virus that survives better in cold water, cold air. And so I think we're all watching very closely and looking for evidence of sick birds in Massachusetts for testing.
Do we have other questions? Just raise your hand if.
I'll put my email in the chat as well. People are welcome to reach out to me afterwards. If you think of questions later, or you want to answer my question about who's at greater risk, the kid kissing the pig or the kid kissing an adult.
Okay, thank you once again, Katie. This was great. And thank you for your support of the museum. And everyone come visit the museum. And the next presentation in this series will be on substance use disorder on November 10th with Donna White. And that's open to the public as well as to our high school students in the program.
Thank you for having me, Al. I appreciate it.